I warn you, this story is not for the faint of heart, because it is about how a 19-month-old baby was actually turned into a dog and how his family and friends became guilty of his death. It will be scary, sometimes disgusting, but still interesting. Now, if you are ready, let's get started. North London, March of 2006, hospital in Edmonton. There was the first cry of a child who was supposed to grow up and enjoy life like most children today. Initially, Peter appeared to be an ordinary infant with big blue eyes and a tendency to sleep a lot, typical of newborns. He became the first child in the family with the 3 daughters. At first, his parents seemed like any other, treating him well and showing no signs of mistreatment towards each other. Nothing suggested that Peter's life would soon be marred by unimaginable cruelty, violence, and a tragic end, but appearances can be deceiving. Imagine a child who was regularly starved, beaten, and left to fend for himself against large dogs that treated him like a toy. A child forced to obey commands like an animal, compelled to sit when he heard a specific sound. Picture a child whose ribs and spine were broken and whose teeth were knocked out by a blow to the face. This was Peter's reality during his short 17 months of life. This account barely scratches at the surface of his suffering. To understand how such atrocities could happen, we need to look at the people around Peter. His parents, social services, and doctors, all of whom were painfully aware of his situation. Peter's mother, Tracy Connolly, had a deeply troubled upbringing. She succinctly described her childhood as a shady times. One of Tracy's few childhood friends who spoke to the press said, "Cruelty was all she knew. It was the norm for her." Tracy's mother, Mary O'Connor, was pregnant 11 times but only gave birth twice. First to a son and then 4 years later in 1981 to Tracy. Mary's children had different fathers. Although she was married to Gary Cox, Tracy was not his biological daughter. Instead, Mary, under the influence of alcohol, had a fling with a married family friend, Richard Johnson. Johnson later claimed it was Gary who orchestrated the encounter, allegedly paying Johnson £5 just over $6 today, to sleep with his wife, treating it all as a joke. Mary O'Connor was far from an exemplary mother. She beat her son when he was only 6 weeks old. By the age of 3, Tracy's older brother had been hospitalized 4 times, with each incident being brushed off as an accident with plausible explanations. Mary O'Connor struggled with alcohol and drug abuse and had a criminal record of stabbing her husband. She justified her actions by explaining that her husband brutally beat and controlled her. "He was a sadist. He hit me for no reason. I couldn't go out without his permission. If I went shopping, he would count the time. I thought it was normal. When you're used to your husband beating you, you think it is normal. In the end, I stabbed him in the stomach in self-defense, but I couldn't prove it, and I got 2 years for it. But it was worth it," Mary recounted. Mary eventually left her husband Gary Cox when Tracy was 2.5 years old. However, this separation did not improve Tracy's life. Mary focused more on her own needs, often neglecting her daughter. Neighbors and schoolmates from 80s and 90s recalled that after leaving Cox, Mary indulged heavily in alcohol and drugs. Numerous men passed through her life, and Tracy was frequently yelled at and seen wandering the streets alone at night. When Tracy started primary school, she quickly became a social outcast. A childhood friend remembered, "At school, she was a child nobody wanted to play with. She was overweight, dirty, and wore shoes that fell apart and old sweatpants. The children called her Tracy the Trump because she was oppressed. She always been beaten up by the other children." Mary O'Connor was aware of the bullying Tracy faced, but believed it was Tracy's own fault. "Honestly, most of the bullying was her fault. She made herself a victim. I don't know why. She was a strong girl," Mary stated. Social workers visited O'Connor home multiple times due to the family's obvious difficulties, as reported by neighbors and school staff. Eventually, because of Mary's indifference and suspected physical abuse, both children were removed from her care. 12-year-old Tracy was placed at Fairly Close boarding school in West Sussex, a school for children with special educational needs and behavioral issues. Mary claimed that Tracy did well at school, but school reports described her as a moody and prone to get into fights. At 16, Tracy passed several exams to earn her high school diploma and secured a job as a hairdresser. However, she wasn't interested in a career. She confided in her best friend that her true aspiration was to have a whole cohort of kids. Mary O'Connor stated that she closely monitored her daughter and discouraged her from having sex. Nevertheless, at 16, Tracy met her future husband, a 17-year-old railway worker. The couple had 2 daughters before marrying in 2003 and later had a 3rd daughter. In 2006, they welcomed baby Peter, whom Connolly described as a long-awaited boy. Mary O'Connor considered the railway worker a good man. I didn't think much of him, but he was a good provider. She had everything she needed. He worked 3 shifts, cooked, cleaned, and washed her clothes. And he wasn't cruel to her, Mary recounted. Despite this, the marriage eventually ended. Several factors contributed to the breakup. Tracy's husband could not tolerate her extreme messiness and, as he later testified in court, her laziness. Tracy also drank heavily and enjoyed flirting, initially online and later in real life. What started as a trivial flirtation eventually led to real infidelity. Things took a turn for the worse when Tracy met Stephen Barker, who was renovating a friend's flat. After a few meetings, Barker began visiting Tracy's home, where she lived with her children and husband. Eventually, her husband's patience wore thin. Mary O'Connor described the situation. Can you imagine coming home to your wife after a hard day's work and seeing a man lying on your couch as if he owned the house waiting for the dinner? When little Peter was 3 months old, Tracy and her husband divorced. In 2006, Barker moved in with Tracy and her children. Tracy seemed infatuated with her new partner. The couple often locked themselves in their bedroom for hours, leaving the children to fend for themselves. Tracy frequently expressed her feeling about her new relationship on social media. It's weird when you meet someone and fall in love. You spend as much time as possible kissing, touching, and having sex. You always feel so good that you can't get enough of each other. It's wonderful. In her diary, Connolly wrote about how love had finally made her life better, wishing it could last forever. Her infatuation with Barker was so intense that she had his initials tattooed on her back, despite his frequent mockery of her weight and his general disrespect towards her. So, who was this Stephen Barker? Born and raised in Tottenham, Barker's background was a familiar tale of neglect. He came from a poor family that didn't care for children, where parents and relatives were often drunk and neglectful. At best, they ignored the children, and worst, they subjected them to violence. Stephen's sister said that as a child, her brother was very fond of torturing animals, such a hobby. He skinned guinea pigs and frogs, broke their legs, sprinkled salt on them, and made them move and die in agony. Barker was abusive, especially toward those closest to him. He often beat his younger relatives and seemed to take pleasure in their suffering. As he grew older, he became notably sad and withdrawn. Friends mentioned it was common for him to lock himself in his room for days. There were rumors that he received treatment for depression, but his friends claimed he preferred to treat his condition by inflicting pain on others. Barker also developed an obsession with Nazism and weapons, collecting related items, and often engaging in conversation about these topics. Interestingly, Barker had a very low IQ of 60, significantly below the average human IQ range of 90 to 108. Despite his low IQ, his impressive height of 1.93 meters appealed to Tracy Connolly, who seemed to overlook his intellectual shortcomings. Apparently, she was not a paragon of common sense herself. What a family! In addition to Barker, his brother Jason Owen, originally also a Barker, but he changed his name either after a family quarrel or following the incident with baby Peter, started visiting and eventually moved into Tracy's home. Jason was as problematic as Stephen. Each blamed the other for the abuse they endured during childhood. Stephen claimed Jason abused him to gain dominance in the family, while Jason insisted it was Stephen who was the abuser. One notorious incident involving both brothers occurred in 1995. Stephen and Jason were accused of attacking their 82-year-old grandmother, Hilda Barker, who lived in a bungalow in the seaside town of Whitstable, Kent. The frightened woman recounted to police how her grandsons had confined her in a closet, pressuring her to alter her will. Stephen and Jason insisted on being named as the beneficiaries of her property and assets. Their intimidation tactics didn't end there. Neighbors reported that the brothers wore masks reminiscent of Guy Fawkes and subjected her to terror. Jacqueline Cole, a 58-year-old neighbor of Mrs. Barker, disclosed to the media. Hilda was visibly bruised whenever they came around. She was terrified each time. Hilda was covered in bruises, but she never said what happened. She always claimed she fell. Following this incident, Hilda Barker was relocated to a nursing home where she succumbed to pneumonia a few months later. However, Stephen and Jason escaped justice for the mistreatment of their grandmother, as all charges were dropped upon her death. Many observers familiar with this case believe the brothers should have been prosecuted for manslaughter. As for Jason Owen, little is known about him, but additional information reveals he was previously on the police radar for theft and arson. By 2006, the household where Peter Connolly and Tracy's 3 daughters resided also included 3 adults. 25-year-old Tracy Connolly herself, her 31-year-old boyfriend Stephen Barker, and his 35-year-old brother Jason Owen. Tracy's home, already disordered and unkempt, deteriorated further with arrival of visitors and 2 additional disorderly adult men. However, the chaos and mess were trivial compared to what unfolded in Peter Connolly's life. On 11 December 2006, 9-month-old Peter was admitted to the hospital with severe injuries for an infant, bruises on his head, nose, chest, and right shoulder. Medical experts concluded these injuries were clearly non-accidental. Subsequently, on 19 December, Tracy Connolly was arrested on suspicion of child abuse. Despite vehemently denying the allegations, Peter was placed on the Haringey Child Protection Register for physical abuse and neglect on 22 December. This intervention meant social services, tasked with safeguarding children in families with questionable background, became involved. Peter briefly stayed with a family friend during this period, but lacking concrete evidence implicating his mother, he was returned to Tracy after 5 weeks. Social services attempt to investigate Tracy's relationship with Barker, who frequently visited her home. Tracy adamantly denied any romantic involvement, insisting they were just friends. If someone found out that they were in a more serious relationship, Tracy would be taken away from welfare. Apparently, that was all she cared about. Sometimes it doesn't even cross my mind where people have so much cynicism and cruelty. The situation remained quiet for a while until 9 April 2007, when Tracy returned to North Middlesex Hospital with Peter, who displayed fresh bruises, a several swollen eye, and swelling on his head. Tracy, as before, denied all accusation, attributing the injuries to accidents like falls or scuffles with other children. Yes, of course, but the following facts will blow your mind. Social workers conducted multiple visits to Tracy and Peter's home, both unannounced and announced. Despite observing Peter covered in bruises, scratches, and abrasions, each time little changed. Tracy answered questions vaguely, reports were failed, and Peter remained under the same care. After yet another bruise appeared on Peter, social workers entrusted a family friend with monitoring Tracy and caring for her son. No further supervision was provided. They relied solely on the friend's assurances. That is, social workers seemed to simply ignore the obvious facts of abuse, which led to even more terrible consequences. Meanwhile, Jason Owen, Steve's brother, and his 15-year-old girlfriend moved into the house. The girlfriend, wanted for being underage and missing, exacerbated Peter's already dire situation. I'm saying they all worse each other. While social workers made repeated visits and doctors documented Peter's injuries, behind closed door, he suffered ongoing abuse. Stephen Barker was directly responsible, pushing, hitting, and causing bruises on the child. Reports suggested that Barker derived pleasure from Peter's distress. Adding to the unsafe environment were several large dogs, possibly Rottweiler, in the house. Sources differed on their number, but all agreed that these animals posed a danger to Peter. They sometimes treated him as a toy, potentially attacking him out of aggression or during roof play. I remind you that Peter was not even 2 years old. It wasn't even a year and a half. The little one was just given to the dogs, and they just tore it up like some kind of toy. But not even the dogs were the scariest thing in the story. All the while, due to the negligence of social workers, the suffering of the little Peter continued. It's even scary to talk about it all, but it's not the end yet. And there will be no happy ending in the story, as you understood. When Owen and his girlfriends moved in, the abuse not only persisted, but intensified. There is limited public information about Owen's actions, but reports indicate he would grab Peter by the legs and spin him around, causing the child to sob uncontrollably. Imagine a healthy man taking a baby by the legs and starting to spin it around with all his might. Firstly, what kind of overloads could the child's brain receive? Secondly, injuries. Beyond physical harm, psychological abuse was also rampant in the household. Stephen, with his obsession with Nazism, forced Peter to greet the family in peculiar manner, waving his hand from his heart to the sun. Disobedience or failure to comply with Barker's orders resulted in Peter's toys being tossed onto the roof, leaving the child devastated, his toys being his world. As the abuse escalated, Barker decided Peter should be trained like a dog. He wanted the toddler to respond to the sound of finger clicking and sit on command, mimicking training techniques for full-legged animal, an unthinkable demand for a child barely 2 years old. Sometimes it is even difficult to imagine what is in the minds of such people. Yes, the world is full of cruel things, but a defenseless child? I hope Barker burns in hell. When a social worker revisited the Trouble home on July 30, Tracy anticipated trouble. Seeing her son's bruised state, she primitively covered his face and hands with chocolate and applied antibacterial cream to his scalp, concealing the signs of recent abuse. Predictably, the social workers report that they described Peter as healthy and happy. Healthy and happy. I just have no words. Can a child with a broken ribs truly appear healthy and happy? Such injuries are often indicative of severe abuse. Maybe the social worker was visually impaired, or maybe he didn't care enough about little Peter that he just wrote delusions in his report. Jason Owen's 15-year-old girlfriend witnessed Peter's mistreatment firsthand. She recounted, "Steve laughed as he hit little Peter, consumed by rage. He inflicted unspeakable acts upon him and recorded them on his phone. Peter cried and screamed, but Steve found amusement in his suffering. It sickened me, but I was too afraid to intervene." That is, this animal also recorded the suffering of little Peter on the phone. Well, this jerk collected evidence for the police himself. Following the ordeal of broken ribs, Peter's spine bore the next brutal assault. Jason's girlfriend vividly recalls a haunting moment from her neighborhood. Steve Barker was sitting on the couch, smiling, smoking marijuana, and treating baby P like a lifeless doll. Suddenly, I heard a horrifying crack that reverberated through the house as the baby's fragile spine snapped in two. Though the exact circumstance remains unclear, it is believed Stephen Barker lifted Peter and forcefully brought him down, slamming his back against his knee. August 1, 2007 marked a crucial turning point in Peter's tragic story. His injuries were so severe and unmistakably inflicted by another person that the denial seemed impossible. That day, Peter was examined by Dr. Saba Izayadi at St. Anne's Hospital in North London. Despite being a qualified pediatrician, Dr. Izayadi overlooked critical signs. She failed to detect existing fractures, later confirmed by autopsy. Shockingly, she dismissed further examination, citing Peter's demeanor as unpleasant and moody. One wonders how a child could not be distressed while enduring broken ribs and a fractured spine. Indeed, how else could a child whose ribs and spine were broken and where there was no place without bruises behave? It just doesn't fit in my head. Peter returned to his torment at home, and tragically, August 1, 2007 marked the last time he experienced the world beyond those walls. The following day, August 2, 2007, Peter suffered a blow to the face that knocked out one of his teeth. The day after, August 3, 2007, at 11:35 a.m., Tracy Connolly dialed 999. She reported her son was unresponsive. Paramedics arrived to find Peter lying in his coat, blue and clad only in a diaper. Despite their efforts to revive him, Peter could not be saved. At 12:20 p.m., doctors pronounced him deceased at North Middlesex Hospital. Peter's suffering was over. But all this could have been avoided if it were not for the negligence of social services and the pediatrician who examined the child. About all this later. Subsequently, medical professionals documented Peter's injuries: broken ribs, a fractured spine, and fingers cruelly bereft of nails. Investigators later discovered a broken tooth in his stomach, the same tooth lost in the fatal blow. That is, imagine, the blow was so strong that the tooth flew right into the child's throat, and he swallowed it. Upon learning of Peter's passing, Tracy collapsed to the hospital floor, wailing,
"God, don't take my little boy away from me. I've waited so long for him."
How did she still have the conscience to do something like that? That very day, Tracy Connolly was taken into custody. Police officers entering the residence of this so-called family were met with a scene that horrified them. The interior was unimaginably filthy, emitting a stench akin to an unclean stable. Dog feces littered the floor, garbage strewn about, dead rats, fleas, bedbugs. Meanwhile, Stephen Barker, accompanied by Jason Owen and a 15-year-old girl, fled to the Debden House Center campsite. It's believed Barker sought to bury a mobile phone in the woods containing evidence of Peter's abuse. All three fugitives were promptly placed on the police's wanted list. At the campsite, managers, realizing Barker wasn't paying for his stay, grew suspicious. His evident nervousness raised further alarms, and upon hearing a police bulletin describing a wanted man resembling Barker, the managers swiftly connected the dots. Stephen and Jason were apprehended and charged. Tracy Connolly vehemently denied all accusations against her, only entering a guilty plea moments before the trial conclusion. She faced charges of causing or permitting the death of a child. Court sentenced her to an indeterminate prison term with a minimum of 5 years, conditional on her no longer posing a threat to society, especially young children. In my opinion, her punishment is quite light, considering that she can be considered a full accomplice. Her guilt in the death of little Peter is no less than Barker's. Tracy was pregnant with Steve Barker's child during Peter's abuse, eventually giving birth to their child while Barker was in prison, serving a 12-year sentence for his role in Peter's death. Like Tracy, Barker was convicted on the charges of causing or allowing the death of a child. Jason Owen initially received an indeterminate sentence with a minimum of 3 years under the same charge, but upon appeal, his sentence was fixed at 6 years. Importantly, none of them were convicted of murdering baby Peter. Tracy Connolly was released on parole on 7 July 2022 amid fears for her safety. The 40-year-old mother, under strict conditions including wearing an electronic bracelet, adhering to her curfew, and restrictions on her movements, activities and contacts, must abide by 20 other conditions of her release. I'm not judge, of course, but a lot of people were also outraged that Tracy was released on house arrest. Both Owen and Barker remain incarcerated. Owen, despite being granted parole at one point, violated the terms of his release. Barker was denied parole especially as he faced separate charges related to the alleged rape of a 2-year-old girl, details of which remain undisclosed due to the sensitive nature of the case. Oh my god, enough. This is just a mess now. The doctor who neglected to detect Peter's broken ribs and spine faced consequences from the General Medical Council, receiving an 18-month ban from practicing unsupervised. This is rather lenient considering such negligence. After all, it was precisely the negligence of the doctor and other social workers that led to the child's death. The case also highlighted systemic issues within Hertfordshire Council's Child Protection Department, reminiscent of the Victoria Climby tragedy in 2000. Following Peter Connolly's death, the council faced severe criticism for its management and staffing shortages within the department. Post-Climby, the department rushed to recruit new staff, but struggled with overworked and emotionally drained employees. Recruitment efforts extended internationally to South Africa and Zimbabwe, resulting in cultural diversity within the department but also challenges in aligning different cultural norms and child-rearing expectations. Some believe that these new recruits were driving more to the opportunity to work in London, save money, and support their families back home rather than a strong commitment to child protection. These factors collectively underscore how systemic failures and human indifference converged tragically in Peter's case, revealing the devastating consequences of negligence. Friends, If you see someone being mistreated, don't just let it go. It is you who can help a helpless person or child escape from the clutches of death. Take care of yourself and stay human. Goodbye.